Europe has a long and complicated history with democracy, and if there is reason to worry about backsliding in some democratic nations on the continent today, it is not for the first time. What can we learn from that? Sheri Berman's latest book is Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Régime to the present day. She is a professor of political science at Columbia University's Barnard College, and she joins us now from New York as part of the joint TVO Toronto Star initiative, the Democracy Agenda. Professor Berman, it's good to meet you. How are you managing through this pandemic?
I'm getting through.
That's the right answer, I think. Yes, indeed. Well, let's just set this up this way. I guess for the last 25 years or so of the 20th century, democracy was really in ascension. It had won the Cold War. It looked like it was the go-to-ism in the world. But the first couple of decades of the 21st century have not been as kind. Orban, Erdogan, Modi, Kaczynski, Duterte, Bolsonaro, and of course in your country, Trump. What is, in your view, the thread that connects all of these challengers to the idea of liberal democracy?
Well, dissatisfaction with democracy is the greatest spur for the rise of autocracy and the rise of illiberal democrats. So if you look at the countries that you mentioned, places like Turkey, Hungary, the Philippines, and Brazil, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the politicians that existed before the rise of these autocrats and with the functioning of the democratic system more generally. So one way to think about the attractiveness of authoritarians is by looking at, again, the context within which they arise, which is rising dissatisfaction with democracy. So when democracies don't do well, people are open to alternatives. And I think that's the place to start an understanding of the rise of these populists, these authoritarians in many parts of the world today.
Okay, let me follow up with this, because you've written that liberal democracy is, quote, a rare and recent phenomenon. What makes the ingredients in it so rare?
Well, takes an awful lot to make democracy work. It takes an awful lot institutionally. It takes an awful lot normatively. Let's start with the first part, the institutions. Democracy only works well where we have strong, well-functioning political parties committed to the rules of the game, where we have an active and independent civil society, where we have a free press, where we have a business community that is not dependent on the state to prosper, where we have citizens who accept the political equality of all citizens, where we have citizens who accept the legitimacy of opposition. These are not easy things to build. And if we look at the history of the West, that is to say the history of countries where democracy has its longest history, we see very clearly that these take a very, very long time to construct, to embed deeply in societies. And so that many countries that only recently made transitions to democracy in places like, again, the Philippines, Brazil, parts of Eastern Europe, we should not be surprised that they are struggling simply because, again, the institutional and normative infrastructure for democracy is vast and difficult to build.
One of my favorite books of all time about democracy is actually not nonfiction, it's a novel, Advise and Consent by Alan Drury. And one of the lines in the book, which I'm sure, actually David Frum tweeted this the other day, which is what reminded me of it as well. Let's bring this up, Sheldon. Democracy is the most fragile thing on earth. For what does it rest upon? You and me, and the fact that we agree to maintain it. The moment either of us says we will not, that's the end of it. That's from Advise and Consent. What do you think of that?
I think that that's a very apt quote, and I think it's 100% correct, right? Which is democracy is a system that depends on the behavior of citizens and the behavior of elites. And sort of going back to something we just discussed, right? It depends on citizens accepting the rules of the game, accepting the equality, the political equality of their fellow citizens, the legitimacy of opposition, elites playing by the rules of the game. And these are not things that come naturally or easily and can be very easily thrown off balance. I think my own country is an excellent example of that. And recognizing how fragile these things are, I think should give us a greater appreciation of, again, as that quote indicates, how much it takes from average citizens and the elites who run the system, the democratic system, for it to keep working well.
I wonder if through your research you've discovered what the tipping point is. In other words, this percentage of the population has to be this ticked off in this strong a fashion for them finally to basically give up on the notions of democracy you've just been referring to?
Well, I don't think, unfortunately, although it would be very nice, that there's a particular percentage or one particular measure we can use and have that always indicate, okay, look, we're at a tipping point now. Democracy is in real danger. But there are obviously a lot of things we can look at that are warning signs, right? When people, as we've already discussed, when people are willing to support politicians and parties who are clearly not committed to playing by the rules of the game, when anger and resentment become the dominant features of political discourse and political interaction, these are the kinds of warning signs that we need to really pay attention to, right? So when you have 40% of a population willing to vote for a person, like in my own country, who's not committed to playing by the rules of the game, that does not mean all of those people are anti-democrats, but it does mean that they are fed up enough with the alternative to be willing to accept some very dangerous moves on the part of the person they do vote for.
It's always a bit dangerous to ask questions about particular cultures, but we are going to tread carefully here by asking you whether you think there are some cultures in this world that come better predisposed to appreciating liberal democracy and democratic governance, as opposed to other cultures which may be more inclined to accept illiberal democracy.
I don't believe that is true at all, and I don't believe that there's actually really much good historical or comparative evidence for that. I teach courses on the development of democracy, and I always ask my students when we get to the end of the Second World War, if given what they know about German history up to that point, if they had to bet their retirement funds on Germany becoming a stable liberal democracy in 1945, would they have done so? I think that would have been a very bad bet to take. I'm also old enough to have taught classes on democracy during a period when discussion of Asian values, quote unquote, was really quite prominent, and the idea that Asian countries could never be democratic. And then we had remarkably successful transitions in places like Taiwan and South Korea. So no, I do not think cultures are more or less democratic. I think people need to learn, as I mentioned before, the democratic rules of the game. And I think often it just takes a significant amount of time and experience with the dictatorial alternatives for them to do so.
Well, those are great examples that you gave, but then others might point to the Middle East and say, here we are a decade after the Arab Spring, which sprung, and nothing happened. And the dreams are just as dashed today as they were 10 years ago. Is that a part of the world where culturally it's just not as on as in the other examples you gave?
Well, I think there's two great ways to look at that. One is just to start with some basic survey data. And if you look at survey data for the Arab world, you can see that people there just as much as people in other parts of the world, embrace some basic goals, right? The desire for self-rule, the desire to be able to, again, choose their leaders and governments. The other thing I think we need to recognize is that the Arab Spring was really the first try at democracy for many of these countries, which are themselves young countries. They are the product of decolonization, not that long ago in the past. And that they failed at their first try at democracy should sadden but not surprise us. If we look back at European history, which of course is what my book is about, you can see that most European countries failed in their first try at democracy, even their second and sometimes even third tries, because, to get back to a theme that we have been discussing, it takes a lot to build up the institutional and normative infrastructure of democracy. So that the Arab Spring failed, just like the event in European history it is echoing, right? The 1848, the springtime of the peoples, should not again surprise, although it should sadden us.
All right, you suggest that the history suggests that we don't know of gradual, liberal, nonviolent paths to democracy. And yet, can I gently push back on that a little bit and say, I think I'm sitting in a country right now that has actually done just that?
So I would say that there are some cases that do approximate that model, and Canada might be a good one. But if we look at the classic cases that people point to in this regard, which are Britain and the United States, I don't think those hold up very well to historical scrutiny. The British case is an interesting one. You know, many people would date the beginning of its modern political development to the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and yet we did not get universal suffrage in that country until the early 20th century. The United States, my own countrymen and women like to think of this country as always having been democratic. That is, of course, not true by any objective standards. It took the bloodiest war in our history, the Civil War, to extend, at least in theory, democratic rights to all citizens. And then it took another 100 years until the civil rights movement in the 1960s to actually bring at least the legal reality of equal political rights to our citizens. So I think it's very hard to find those cases of gradual, peaceful political development. But I will have to concede perhaps the Canadian case, but I don't think there are more than a handful of them.
Well, that's a great point that you just made, because when people talk about the American Republic, we often think in terms of a place that's more than 200 years old. And the fact of the matter is, as you've just pointed out, genuine American democracy, where it was in law, is a 5.5-decade-old phenomenon. And I wonder whether you think Trump's election signals the kind of birthing pains of a multiracial democracy that we don't necessarily think of as being that new a thing in the United States. What do you think?
I think that's an excellent way, in fact, to think about what is going on in the United States today. It is really only since the civil rights movement that we have been a full liberal democracy, according to any definition that would be used by social scientists, because up until then, again, a part of the country remained essentially an oligarchy. That is to say, in the South, African Americans were denied their political rights and the social and economic privileges that would go along with them. And so if we think about the fact that it's only been since then that we have really tried to turn our democracy into a democracy for all citizens, regardless of their background, regardless of their skin color, then many of the difficulties that we are dealing with today begin to make more sense, right? Turning us into a diverse liberal democracy. This is a very difficult thing, and we have been struggling with it, indeed, as you say, only for a number of decades rather than the centuries that Americans like to think of themselves as having lived in a full democracy.
And we look from north of the border with utter fascination at how you are doing this and facing these challenges. And I guess I do wonder how your liberal democracy, how it intends to deal with the reactionaries within it who prefer the past to the present or the future and fear that they will have no hand in shaping that future.
Well, this is another really great question. Historically, groups that are losing status and political power, they are resistant. That is simply normal and expected. Again, not normatively good, but what one could expect given the reality of the situation. What's crucial, of course, is to create positive rather than zero-sum games. Our politicians need to make people understand that incorporating new people and new groups into our democracy does not mean that they will suffer politically, socially, or economically, but that we can build a better democracy, a better economy, and a better society where everyone can prosper. If we let people think that democracy or the economy are zero-sum games, they will react accordingly by resenting and getting angry at the gains of other groups. And so it is incumbent upon democratic politicians to create policies and situations that enable us to see that we have something to gain from including fellow citizens in the American dream, rather than we can only win by excluding others.
As you see it, though, even if the Democratic Party did that, would the 74 million who voted for Trump be open to it anyway?
I think that you do not have to convince everybody that you are right, but what you do have to convince people of is that you are not dangerous. That is to say, democracy does not require all citizens agreeing. If all citizens agreed, in fact, democracy would be superfluous. What democracy cannot take are zero-sum games. What democracy cannot take is the sense that if the opposition comes to power, it is threatening or dangerous, right? So all the Democrats need to do, and I say all not meaning this is easy, right, is not, they don't have to convince everyone, but they do have to tamp down the temperature. They do need to tamp down the level of fear and resentment. And that is really what we have to look for over the next years in American society.
I think, Professor Berman, one of the things that makes doing that so difficult, and I've probably only heard this 1,000 times from progressive / big D Democrats over the last couple of years, is that I've heard it over and over and over again. How can these lower middle class and lower class people in the South, for example, how can they vote Republican? They're clearly voting against their own economic interests, which of course doesn't appreciate the fact that culture, not just economy, is a huge part of this debate. How do we get from A to B on that?
Well, I think that's also sort of a great question, right? Which is because people, whether they're lower class, whether they're middle class, whether they're upper class, have a variety of interests and goals they bring to the political arena, right? Economic, but also cultural or moral. And so we need to figure out ways, again, to tamp down the temperature. Personally, I think that debating certain kinds of cultural issues is very difficult for democracy. And so you don't want them to dominate political discussion, because if people feel like their values are being threatened, it becomes very difficult for them to focus on anything else, right? So if we want people in the South, let's say, as you mentioned, to focus on what parties and politicians are going to best serve their economic interests, we need to have them not focused on what they see as threats to their cultural or social interests. And I think that can be done. I mean, if you look at survey data on American politics, for instance, cultural issues have really jumped in importance over the last 10 or so years. That is to say, they have dominated political discussion. This is not necessarily the time when we've made the most progress on those things, but we are focusing on them more. I think that we perhaps want to flip the switch a little bit and focus on some other issues as well, which does not preclude making progress on some of these underlying social and cultural problems, but it does mean focusing not exclusively on them.
Let's play a clip here. This is Cornel West, whom you know, of course, philosopher, political activist, pondering what Plato said about democracy some 2,500 years ago. Sheldon, the clip, if we could.
The founding texts of the Western philosophical tradition, Plato's Republic, provides the most powerful indictment of not just democratic practices, but the possibility of democracy. And he argues that every democratic experiment, every experiment in which those Stone called everyday people attempt to govern themselves, will result in tyranny, because there's too much unruly passion and pervasive ignorance among the demos, among everyday people. So we're still wrestling with Plato's challenge. Plato's challenge will never go away, will never go away, because the fascist possibilities of any democratic experiment are always there. I don't care which part of the world you're talking about.
I mean, he's presaging January 6th there and the insurrection on Capitol Hill, and whether or not democracy is always going to be in danger of being vulnerable to that. What do you think?
Well, I think, as we've discussed, democracy is always in danger. It is quite fragile. However, I have to push back against this sort of idea, if only because we really don't have a lot of good examples of dictatorships or oligarchies that rule in a much better fashion. That is to say, of dictatorships or oligarchies that do a better job of protecting the interests of the people rather than the interests of the rulers. So, to quote Winston Churchill, perhaps against Plato, 2 cheers for democracy, right? It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. Sure, people, just like elites, have a tendency towards ignorance and passion. What's crucial is to make sure that our politics does not prey on those things, does not aggravate those things, but tries to appeal to people's, again, more rational and logical selves. But, it's easy to piss on democracy. And, again, given the state of democracy in my own country today, I am very prone to that particular tendency. But let's remember what the alternatives are and how much worse they actually are.
Well, one of the worst characteristics that too many Canadians have is that we're incredibly sanctimonious and smug as it relates to our moral authority in this world. And I might just point your attention to the Economist's Democracy Index, which came out not that long ago, in which Canada moved up a couple of spots. We're now 5th. and which America, I think, was 25th. And for a place that many of us grew up thinking of as supposedly the shining city on a hill, well, I'm curious, what was your reaction when you saw that you're 25th best democracy in the world?
Well, I study democracy, so this doesn't surprise me. The United States has been on a decline, and that decline accelerated greatly during the Trump administration. So the actual ranking doesn't surprise me, and in fact coincides with the assessment of experts in other organizations that look at the state of democracy. What this says, though, exactly as you indicate, is that we are very far from the self-image of the city on the hill that a lot of Americans would like to hold. We have a lot to do to correct the problems in our society, to correct the problems in our economy, and to correct the problems in our democracy. And I think we can, and I hope that the Biden administration is able to do so, because what happens in the United States, for better or worse, has a lot of implications outside of the United States for, again, the state of democracy in the world more generally, and peace and prosperity across the globe.
Well, you have led me very nicely to where I want to end up our conversation, because I want to read an excerpt from something you wrote. This is you in Dissent magazine in the winter of 2018, and here we go. As recent elections in the United States and Europe have made clear, the more people believe that political elites and institutions are unresponsive to them, the more likely they are to want to sideline or even eliminate them, continuing to allow wealthy individuals and special interests outsized influence on politics, or insulating political institutions and policymaking further from the people, is therefore likely to increase support for populism rather than diminish it. Oligarchy or technocracy and populism are not opposites, but evil political twins. The former seek to limit democracy to save liberalism. The latter seeks to limit liberalism to save democracy. Neither is wise, and they feed off and intensify the other. Well, I want you to, that's very well written, I have to say. Well done. And I guess I need you to sort of follow up on the last answer you gave, which is how much hope you do hold out that things are going to be different under Joe Biden and that his administration gets all this.
Well, this very nicely brings us full circle, because really underlying democracy is the idea that it is a political system that serves or is responsive to the people. And when people feel like politicians and parties are not responding to their demands, are not solving the challenges their societies face, they become dissatisfied. And as we discussed right at the beginning, therefore willing to potentially embrace even radical or extreme alternatives. If we want democracy to flourish in the United States or around the globe, we have to figure out a way to make our politicians, our parties, our democratic institutions more responsive to the problems that people face, to the challenges that societies face. That is the key to democratic success. It's the key to the success of any society. And our democratic institutions, certainly in the United States, by many, many measures, have become less responsive over the past decades. And I think Donald Trump is one indication of that. And so figuring out how to make democracy speak to the people, respond to the people's needs, that is another way of thinking about what Joe Biden's administration and American democracy has to do in the years going forward.
Hear, hear. Sheri Berman, professor of political science, Barnard College, New York City. Awfully good of you to join us on TVO tonight. There's your book on the screen as well, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe. We're so grateful for your time, and stay safe out there, okay?
My pleasure. You too.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.